The worn leather notebook slipped from Benjamin Carter's trembling fingers as turbulence rocked the Boeing 737. Across the narrow aisle, Billionaire CEO Amanda Foster glanced up from her tablet, initially annoyed by the disturbance. But then she heard it, a gentle voice switching effortlessly from Italian to French, then German, as a father helped his 8-year-old daughter understand why airplanes sometimes shake. "Non aver paura, tesoro," he whispered, then repeated in perfect French. "N'aie pas peur, ma chérie." The little girl's worried expression melted into wonder as her father continued in what sounded like Spanish, then Russian, then something Amanda couldn't identify. 7 languages in less than 2 minutes, each phrase carrying the same tender reassurance. Amanda found herself leaning forward, captivated not just by the linguistic display, but by something deeper, a devotion so pure it seemed to transform the cramped economy cabin into something sacred. "Daddy, will you tell me the story about the brave little sparrow again?" Benjamin Carter adjusted his threadbare jacket and glanced at his watch, a simple Timex that had stopped working 3 months ago, but he couldn't bring himself to remove it. The flight from New York to San Francisco stretched ahead of them, and Lily was already fidgeting in the middle seat he'd managed to secure next to the window. Her pressed nose against the small porthole left a fog circle that she traced with her finger, drawing invisible pictures only she could see. "The clouds look like Mama's blanket," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible above the engine's hum. Benjamin's chest tightened at the innocent observation. Sarah's cream-colored throw still lay folded on their living room couch, untouched for 18 months now. He'd tried washing it once, desperate to remove the faint scent of her lavender perfume, but had broken down in the laundry room, clutching the fabric against his face. Amanda Foster sat 3 rows ahead in first class, her manicured fingers dancing across her tablet screen as quarterly reports demanded her attention. At 42, she commanded a tech empire worth $3.7 billion, yet something about the gentle murmur of foreign languages behind her kept pulling her focus away from profit margins and market projections. She'd built Sterling Dynamics from a tiny startup in her garage to a global powerhouse, sacrificing marriage, friendships, and the possibility of children along the way. The divorce papers from Marcus had been finalized just 6 months ago. Irreconcilable differences, her lawyer had explained. Though Amanda knew the truth was simpler, she'd chosen corporate success over human connection one too many times. The turbulence struck again, more violent this time, and several passengers gasped as their drinks spilled. Lily's small hand gripped her father's arm, her knuckles white with fear. Benjamin immediately reached for the worn leather notebook that had fallen to the floor. Sarah's journal, filled with lullabies and stories written in 7 different languages she'd learned during their travels together. Before her illness, before the hospital bills, before the long nights when words in any language seemed inadequate to express his grief. "Papillon," he began softly, the French word rolling naturally from his tongue. "Once upon a time, there was a little butterfly who was afraid to fly." His voice carried the slight accent Sarah had loved, not quite American, picked up from years of living abroad during his graduate studies. Lily's breathing slowed as he continued the story in Italian, then switched to German for the part about the wise old owl, each transition as smooth as silk. Amanda found herself holding her breath. She'd heard plenty of polyglots in international business meetings, but this was different. This wasn't about impressing clients or closing deals. This was pure love translated into whatever language could best comfort a frightened child. She closed her tablet and turned slightly, catching glimpses of the father and daughter through the gap between seats. The man appeared to be in his late 30s, with prematurely grey temples and hands that spoke of manual labor, rough, calloused, but incredibly gentle as they turned the pages of his notebook. His daughter was a miniature version of someone else, delicate features that must have come from her mother. Benjamin realized, because she certainly didn't inherit them from his weathered face. The child wore a simple dress that had been carefully mended at the sleeve, and her shoes showed the kind of wear that suggested they were her only pair. And then the butterfly realized. Benjamin continued in Spanish, his voice taking on the warm cadence Sarah had used during their honeymoon in Barcelona. That being afraid didn't make her weak. It made her careful, and sometimes careful is exactly what you need to be. He switched to Russian for the next part, then to what sounded like Portuguese, weaving the tale through languages like a master craftsman working with different colored threads. Amanda's phone buzzed with an urgent email from her assistant. The Henderson acquisition required her immediate attention. Millions of dollars hung in the balance, but she couldn't tear herself away from the quiet drama unfolding behind her. When had she last heard someone speak with such unguarded tenderness? When had anyone ever taken such care with her fears? The notebook's pages were yellowed and soft from countless readings. Some entries were written in elegant handwriting that clearly wasn't Benjamin's, flowing script that spoke of education and refinement. Other notes were scrawled in his heavier hand, translations and phonetic spellings that suggested late nights spent learning pronunciation he'd never quite mastered. At the bottom of one page, Amanda caught sight of a child's crayon drawing, a family of 3 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. "Why did Mama write in so many different words, Daddy?" Lily asked, her fear forgotten in the magic of the multilingual tale. Benjamin's pause lasted just a heartbeat too long. "Because love sounds different in every language, sweetheart. Your mama wanted to make sure you could hear it, no matter where life took you." His thumb traced the margin of a page where Sarah had written, "For our little global citizen in fading blue ink." The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, announcing their descent into San Francisco. Amanda realized she'd accomplished nothing during the 4-hour flight. No emails answered, no deals closed, no strategic plans reviewed. Instead, she'd been transported by a stranger's devotion and a dead woman's journal. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, who commanded respect in 7 different time zones, had been mesmerized by a man who commanded love in 7 different languages. As passengers began gathering their belongings, Amanda noticed Benjamin carefully returning the notebook to a worn canvas bag. His movements were precise, protective, the way someone handles their most precious possession. Lily chattered excitedly about seeing the Golden Gate Bridge, but her father's eyes held a distant sadness that hadn't lifted even during the storytelling. Amanda made a sudden decision that would have surprised anyone who knew her reputation for calculated moves. She stood up, smoothed her designer blazer, and walked back toward economy class. The closer she got, the more she noticed details that her privileged perspective had initially missed. The careful way Benjamin had repacked their few belongings, the generic airport snacks instead of the premium meal service she'd enjoyed, the fact that neither of them had so much as a carry-on bag beyond that single canvas satchel. "Excuse me," she said, her voice softer than her usual boardroom tone. Benjamin looked up, surprised to find an impeccably dressed woman addressing him. "I couldn't help but overhear your story. Your daughter is very lucky to have such a devoted father." Benjamin's cheeks flushed slightly. "Thank you, Mom. She's everything to me." The simple honesty in his voice hit Amanda like a physical force. When was the last time someone had spoken about her with such unguarded love? When was the last time she'd felt like anyone's everything? "Are you visiting San Francisco?" Amanda asked, already knowing she was overstepping social boundaries, but unable to stop herself. "Job interview," Benjamin replied, his hand instinctively moving to protect the canvas bag. "Teaching position at a community college. It's been a difficult few years." The admission seemed to surprise him, as if he hadn't meant to reveal so much to a stranger. Lily tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, tell the nice lady about Mama's book." Benjamin's expression shifted, a shadow crossing his features. "It's not really a book, sweetheart. Just some notes your mama made." But Amanda was already intriguing by the implications. A man who spoke 7 languages fluently, carrying a journal filled with stories in multiple tongues, interviewing for a position at a community college. The pieces didn't quite fit together, and Amanda Foster had built her fortune on recognizing when pieces didn't fit. As they prepared to disembark, Amanda found herself walking behind the father and daughter through the jet bridge. She watched Benjamin guide Lily carefully through the crowd, his hand never leaving her shoulder, his eyes constantly scanning for potential dangers or delays. The protective instincts of someone who'd learned that the world could take away everything that mattered without warning. At baggage claim, Amanda realized they weren't waiting for luggage. Everything they owned for this trip fit in that single canvas bag. The realization hit her with unexpected force. This man had scraped together enough money for 2 plane tickets, probably spending savings he couldn't afford, chasing a job opportunity that might or might not pan out. Meanwhile, she'd flown first class without a second thought, spending more on a single business lunch than this family probably had for their entire trip. "Mr. Amanda approached them again, extending her hand. "Carter, Benjamin Carter, and this is Lily." Benjamin's handshake was firm but brief, the greeting of someone unaccustomed to attention from women in $1,000 suits. "Amanda Foster." She watched for recognition, but Benjamin's expression remained politely blank. Most people knew her name, her company, her reputation. His lack of awareness was somehow refreshing. "I hope your interview goes well, Mr. Carter. San Francisco is lucky to have someone with your talents." As they parted ways in the terminal, Amanda found herself thinking about the notebook, about Sarah's elegant handwriting, about a love story written in 7 languages. She'd built an empire on recognizing talent and opportunity, on seeing potential where others saw only surface details. Something about Benjamin Carter and his daughter had triggered every instinct she'd learned to trust in business. But this wasn't business. This was something else entirely, something that had been missing from her carefully constructed life for longer than she cared to admit. As she slid into the back of her waiting Tesla, Amanda made a decision that would surprise even her closest advisors. She was going to find out more about Benjamin Carter and his remarkable linguistic abilities. She was going to discover why a man who could speak 7 languages was interviewing for entry-level teaching positions. And most importantly, she was going to figure out what had happened to Lily's mother and why her memory seemed to haunt every word Benjamin spoke. The notebook had left more questions than answers, but Amanda Foster had never backed down from a puzzle, especially not one that had managed to capture her attention so completely that she'd forgotten about quarterly reports and acquisition deals for the first time in decades. Something told her that Benjamin Carter was about to change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But first, she needed to understand the story behind those 7 languages and that worn leather journal. What Amanda didn't know was that she was about to uncover a connection that would shake the very foundations of everything she thought she knew about fate, forgiveness, and the power of words to heal wounds that had festered for far too long. 3 days later, Amanda sat in her corner office on the 42nd floor of the Sterling Dynamics Tower, staring at a file that had taken her private investigator less than 24 hours to compile. Benjamin Carter's life story lay spread across her mahogany desk in neat typewritten pages, and each revelation hit her like a physical blow. Dr. Benjamin Carter, former professor of comparative literature at Columbia University, published author of 12 academic papers on cross-cultural narrative translation, recipient of the Fulbright Fellowship for European Studies. Married to Dr. Sarah Chen Carter, molecular biologist specializing in cancer research. The golden couple of academia, photographed at university galas and international conferences, their combined brilliance promising to change the world. Then came the medical records, Sarah's diagnosis with stage 4 pancreatic cancer at age 32, the experimental treatments that drained their savings, Benjamin's leave of absence that became permanent resignation when Sarah needed round-the-clock care, the mounting hospital bills that forced them to sell their Manhattan apartment, their car, her grandmother's wedding ring. The death certificate dated 18 months ago, followed by bankruptcy proceedings that left Benjamin with nothing but debt and a 3-year-old daughter who couldn't understand why Mommy wasn't coming home. But it was the last page that made Amanda's hands shake. A photocopy of a publishing contract dated 12 years ago. The client, Sterling Industries, Amanda's father's company before she inherited and expanded it. The project, translation of CEO William Foster's memoir from English into 6 languages for international publication. The translator, Dr. Benjamin Carter, listed as an independent contractor, paid $25,000 for work that took him 8 months to complete. Amanda's father's memoir, Building Bridges, A Life in Global Business, the book that had salvaged Sterling Industries' reputation after the accounting scandal that nearly destroyed everything William Foster had built. The international sales had generated enough revenue to keep the company afloat during the worst financial crisis in their history. Amanda had been 28 then, fresh out of business school, watching her inheritance crumble until that book somehow turned their fortunes around. She'd never known who translated it. Her father had handled the arrangements himself, insisting on working with the best in the business, but never mentioning names. William Foster had died of a heart attack 2 years later, taking most of his business secrets with him. Amanda had inherited a thriving company built on the foundation of that memoir's unexpected success, never knowing that a quiet professor named Benjamin Carter had been the invisible hand that guided their salvation. The irony was suffocating. While Benjamin struggled to pay for his wife's cancer treatments, Amanda had been building her empire on the profits generated by his words. While he sold everything he owned to afford experimental therapies, she'd been expanding internationally using the connections established by his translations. While he held Sarah's hand in hospital rooms, Amanda had been celebrating quarterly growth that stemmed directly from his forgotten contribution. Her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ms. Foster, the Henderson acquisition meeting has been moved to 4 o'clock. Amanda stared at the contract bearing Benjamin's signature. Confident strokes from a man who had no idea his words would fund the success of someone who would later sit in first class while he struggled in economy. "Cancel all my meetings," Amanda said quietly, "and get my car ready." The community college where Benjamin was interviewing occupied a small campus in the Mission District, its aging buildings a stark contrast to the gleaming towers of downtown San Francisco. Amanda found herself sitting in her Tesla across the street, watching through rain-streaked windows as faculty members hurried between classes. She felt ridiculous, a billionaire CEO stalking a struggling single father like some kind of corporate vigilante. At 3:15, she spotted him emerging from the main building. Even from a distance, she could see the slump in his shoulders, the careful way he checked his phone, the resignation in his posture that suggested the interview hadn't gone well. He walked to a bus stop and sat on the metal bench, rain beginning to soak through his thin jacket. Amanda made a decision that went against every calculated instinct she'd developed over 20 years in business. She grabbed an umbrella from her back seat and crossed the street. "Mr. Carter?" Benjamin looked up, surprised to see the woman from the airplane approaching with a designer umbrella. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I recognized you. How did your interview go?" Benjamin's smile was polite, but strained. "Not as well as I'd hoped, I'm afraid. They're looking for someone with more recent classroom experience." He gestured vaguely toward the college buildings. Turns out being out of academia for 3 years is considered a significant gap. Amanda sat beside him on the wet bench, her $1,000 coat instantly soaked by accumulated rainwater. "That seems short-sighted of them," A man with your linguistic abilities could revolutionize their language program." "You're very kind, Miss—" Benjamin looked at her questioningly, and Amanda realized he still had no idea who she was. "Foster. Amanda Foster." She watched his face carefully, but there was no recognition. The name that commanded instant attention in boardrooms around the world meant nothing to this gentle man, whose words had once saved her father's company. The bus arrived with a mechanical wheeze, its doors opening to reveal a handful of tired commuters. Benjamin stood, shouldering his canvas bag. "This has been a difficult transition," he admitted, speaking more to himself than to Amanda. "I keep thinking Sarah would know what to do. She always saw possibilities where I only saw problems." "Where is Lily now?" Amanda asked, surprising herself with the personal question. "After-school program at the YMCA. Free childcare until 6 o'clock. Benjamin's voice held no shame, just the practical acceptance of someone who'd learned to navigate systems designed for people with more resources than hope. "I should get going. The bus ride takes an hour, and she worries if I'm late." Amanda watched the bus pull away, carrying Benjamin back to whatever modest accommodations he'd found in a city that ate dreams for breakfast and charged premium prices for the privilege. She sat alone on the bench as rain continued falling, feeling the weight of a moral debt she'd never known she owed. That evening, Amanda did something she hadn't done in 15 years. She called in sick. Instead of attending the Henderson acquisition dinner that could have netted her company $50 million, she drove to the public library in Benjamin's neighborhood and spent 4 hours reading her father's memoir. Not the English version she'd skimmed years ago, but the Italian translation that had opened European markets, the French edition that had impressed Parisian investors, the German version that had secured their biggest manufacturing contract. Benjamin's translation work wasn't just technically perfect, it was artistically brilliant. He'd managed to capture not just her father's words, but his voice, his personality, his peculiar way of mixing business wisdom with folksy humor. Reading the memoir in different languages was like watching a master painter work with different colored palettes to create the same stunning portrait. More than that, Benjamin had somehow made William Foster sound more thoughtful, more introspective than he'd been in English. The international versions contained nuances and emotional depths that hadn't existed in the original manuscript. Benjamin hadn't just translated her father's words, he'd elevated them, transformed a competent business memoir into something approaching literature. No wonder the international sales had been so successful. No wonder foreign investors had been impressed by William Foster's sophisticated global perspective. Benjamin Carter had given her father a voice he'd never possessed, wisdom he'd never expressed, depth he'd never achieved on his own. And Amanda had built her empire on that foundation, never knowing the name of the man who'd made it possible. The next morning brought news that Benjamin's situation was even more precarious than she'd imagined. Her investigator's follow-up report revealed eviction notices, unpaid medical bills, and a custody evaluation scheduled for the following month. Lily's maternal grandmother was petitioning for guardianship, arguing that Benjamin couldn't provide adequate stability. The court documents painted a picture of a loving father whose grief and financial struggles were being used against him by people who measured parental fitness in bank balances and property deeds. Amanda stared at the custody filing until the words blurred together. Lily could be taken away from the only parent she had left, separated from the father who read her stories in 7 languages and carried her mother's memory in a worn leather notebook. The injustice of it made Amanda's chest tight with unfamiliar emotion. She thought about the gentle way Benjamin had comforted his daughter during turbulence, the patience in his voice as he'd translated love into whatever language could best reach a frightened child. She thought about Lily's trust, her obvious adoration for the father who'd sacrificed everything to care for her. Then she thought about courtrooms and custody evaluators who would see only financial instability, not the wealth of devotion that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. Amanda Foster had spent 20 years making calculated business decisions based on profit margins and market projections. But this wasn't business. This was about a debt she'd never known she owed, and a chance to repay it before it was too late. She picked up her phone and dialed her assistant. "Clear my schedule for the rest of the week, and get me the contact information for the best family law attorney in California." The phone call came on a Thursday morning while Benjamin was heating leftover oatmeal on the single working burner in their studio apartment. Lily sat at the small folding table they used for meals, homework, and Benjamin's job applications, carefully coloring a picture she'd drawn of the Golden Gate Bridge. "Mr. Carter, this is Jennifer Walsh from Sterling Dynamics. Ms. Foster would like to meet with you regarding a potential employment opportunity." Benjamin nearly dropped the saucepan. Sterling Dynamics was one of the largest tech companies in the world, their headquarters visible from half the city. "I think there might be some mistake. I don't have any experience in technology." Ms. Foster was quite specific. "She's interested in discussing a position that would utilize your linguistic expertise. Would tomorrow at 10 o'clock work for your schedule?" Benjamin looked around their cramped apartment, at the stack of rejection letters on the windowsill, at Lily's drawings taped to walls that would soon belong to someone else if he couldn't make rent. "Yes," he said quietly. "Tomorrow at 10 would be fine." The Sterling Dynamics building rose 47 floors into the San Francisco sky, its glass and steel exterior reflecting clouds that seemed close enough to touch. Benjamin had never been inside a building taller than 5 stories, and the elevator ride to Amanda's office left him dizzy with vertigo and possibility. Amanda's corner office was larger than their entire apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the bay. Benjamin tried not to stare at the expensive art on the walls, the awards and accolades, the evidence of success beyond anything he'd ever imagined. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Carter. Please, sit." Amanda gestured to a leather chair that probably cost more than Benjamin made in a month during his substitute teaching days. "I have a proposition that might interest you." Benjamin perched on the edge of the chair, his canvas bag clutched protectively in his lap. "Ms. Foster, I should be honest. I'm not sure why you called me. My background is in literature and translation, not technology." Amanda smiled, and for the first time since their meeting on the airplane, Benjamin saw something genuine in her expression. "That's exactly why I called you. Sterling Dynamics is expanding our global operations, and we need someone to head our new international communications division, someone who can not only translate documents, but understand cultural nuances that make the difference between business success and failure." The salary figure Amanda mentioned made Benjamin's ears ring. It was more money than he and Sarah had ever made combined, more than enough to secure Lily's future, pay off their debts, and maybe even buy back some of the stability they'd lost. But it seemed impossible, like a fairy tale told in a language he couldn't quite believe. "I don't understand," Benjamin said slowly. "There must be hundreds of qualified candidates with actual corporate experience. Why would you consider me?" Amanda had prepared for this question, rehearsed a dozen different answers that skirted the truth, while emphasizing Benjamin's qualifications. But looking at his honest face, seeing the hope and confusion warring in his expression, she found herself abandoning all pretense. "Because 12 years ago you translated my father's memoir into 6 languages. Those translations saved our company and built the foundation for everything Sterling Dynamics has become." Amanda pulled out a copy of the contract, bearing Benjamin's signature. "You probably don't remember the project. It was just another freelance job to you. But those words you crafted, the way you captured not just meaning but heart, they changed everything." Benjamin stared at the contract, memory flooding back. William Foster's memoir had been one of the last projects he'd completed before Sarah's diagnosis. 8 months of careful work translating American business philosophy into European sensibilities. He'd been proud of that translation, had spent extra time ensuring every cultural reference landed correctly, every joke translated with appropriate humor. "I remember," he whispered. "Your father wrote about building bridges between cultures. I tried to make each version feel like it was originally written in that language. You succeeded beyond anything we'd imagined. The international success of that memoir pulled Sterling Industries back from bankruptcy." Amanda leaned forward, her voice intense with conviction. "Mr. Carter, I owe you a debt I never knew existed. That book didn't just save our company, it funded my education, my opportunities, everything I've built since then. While you were struggling, I was thriving on the foundation of your words. The revelation hit Benjamin like a physical force. All those years ago, while he'd been consumed with academic pressures and wedding preparations, his translation work had been supporting the rise of a business empire. While Sarah fought cancer and they sold everything they owned, Amanda Foster had been building her fortune on profits generated by his forgotten contribution. "I don't know what to say," Benjamin admitted. "I just did the work I was hired to do. You did far more than that. You gave my father a voice he never had, wisdom he never possessed. You made him sound like the global businessman he wanted to be rather than the American executive he actually was." Amanda's voice carried a weight of recognition he'd never received. "And now I want to give you the opportunity you deserve. Not charity, Mr. Carter. Justice." Benjamin thought about Lily's custody evaluation, about the eviction notice, about the look in his daughter's eyes when she asked why they had to keep moving. He thought about Sarah's journal, about promises made in 7 languages, about the future they'd planned before cancer stole their dreams. "There's something else," Amanda continued. "The position comes with comprehensive health insurance, relocation assistance, and a signing bonus that should address any immediate financial concerns." She slid a folder across the desk. "I took the liberty of having my legal team review your custody situation. With stable employment and housing, there should be no question about Lily remaining with you." Benjamin's hands shook as he opened the folder. The employment contract was more generous than anything he'd dared imagine, but it was the custody evaluation addendum that brought tears to his eyes. Amanda had somehow arranged for character witnesses, financial guarantees, and legal support that would make his case unassailable. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. "Why would you do all this for a stranger?" Amanda thought about her empty penthouse apartment, about quarterly reports that meant nothing at 3 a.m, about the success that had cost her every meaningful relationship she'd ever had. "Because I've spent 20 years building an empire, and I've never once heard someone speak about me the way Lily talks about you. Because I've never seen love translated into 7 languages. Because some debts can only be repaid by changing someone's life the way they unknowingly changed yours." Benjamin looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city spread below, at the life he'd never imagined possible. "I accept," he said quietly. "But I have one condition." Amanda raised an eyebrow, intrigued by his boldness. "Name it." "I want to continue Sarah's work. The journal, the stories, the idea that love sounds different in every language." Benjamin's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "I want Sterling Dynamics to sponsor cultural exchange programs, translation services for immigrant families, literacy programs that celebrate multilingual heritage. I want Lily to grow up in a world where speaking 7 languages is seen as a gift, not an oddity." For the first time in months, Amanda felt something she'd almost forgotten, genuine excitement about the future. "I think we can arrange that, Mr. Carter. I think we can arrange that and much more." As Benjamin signed the contract that would transform his and Lily's lives, Amanda realized that she'd been wrong about debts and justice. This wasn't about repaying what she owed Benjamin Carter. This was about recognizing that some connections transcend business transactions. Some stories require more than one voice to tell them properly, and sometimes the most important translations happen not between languages, but between hearts that have learned to speak the same truth in different ways. 3 months later, Amanda Foster stood in the doorway of Sterling Dynamics' new Cultural Communications Center, watching Benjamin work with a team of translators on their first major project, translating children's books into 20 different languages for distribution to immigrant communities across California. Lily sat at a small desk nearby, carefully illustrating her own story about a butterfly who learned that being different made her beautiful, not broken. The worn leather notebook lay open beside Lily's artwork, Sarah's elegant handwriting visible in the margins where she'd once written, "For our little global citizen." But now there were new additions: Amanda's careful notes in English, Benjamin's translations, and Lily's crayon drawings of families that looked nothing alike, but loved in languages that sounded exactly the same. Amanda had spent her entire career building bridges between companies, markets, and profit margins. But watching Benjamin and Lily work together, seeing the joy in their faces as they planned programs that would help other families preserve their linguistic heritage, she realized she'd finally learned to build the only bridges that truly mattered, the ones that connected hearts across the arbitrary boundaries of language, culture, and circumstance. The story that began with 7 languages spoken on an airplane had become something larger than any of them had imagined. It had become proof that some words are so powerful they can travel through time to save the people who once saved others, that love really does sound different in every language, and that sometimes the most important conversations happen not between strangers, but between souls who were always meant to find each other. In the end, Benjamin Carter's gift had never been his ability to speak 7 languages. His gift had been his ability to recognize that every language was simply another way of saying the same essential truth, that we all need to be seen, understood, and loved exactly as we are. And Amanda Foster's gift had been her belated recognition that some debts can only be repaid by ensuring that such gifts are never forgotten again. Thomas felt the familiar wariness that came with any invitation that might expose his carefully guarded privacy. "Mrs. Stone, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure that's appropriate. We barely know each other." "That's exactly the point," Elizabeth replied, and Thomas could hear the smile in her voice. "Emma hasn't stopped talking about the paper airplanes you made for her. She wants to show you the model aircraft she's been building. And frankly, after what you did for us, I'd like the chance to thank you properly." There was something in her voice that made Thomas pause, not the professional courtesy of a CEO conducting business, but genuine warmth from a mother who wanted to express gratitude. Against his better judgment, he found himself agreeing to meet at a small restaurant in Capitol Hill, neutral territory that wouldn't feel too formal or too intimate. The dinner that evening would prove to be more revealing than any of them anticipated. Emma Stone arrived with a shoebox full of model airplanes she'd constructed from kits, each one bearing evidence of careful attention to detail and an obvious fascination with flight mechanics. Danny, initially shy around the successful CEO and her precocious daughter, found himself drawn into conversations about aerodynamics and aircraft design. "Mr. Wright," Emma said, holding up a partially completed model of a Boeing 737. "I can't get the landing gear to fit properly. The instructions don't make sense." She handed the model to Thomas with the complete confidence that he would know exactly how to fix it. Thomas examined the small plastic components, his mind automatically shifting into the problem-solving mode that had once made him an exceptional pilot. "The issue is with the alignment pins," he said, gently adjusting the tiny parts. "In real aircraft, landing gear has to retract into wheel wells with perfect precision. If the alignment is off by even a few millimeters, the gear won't deploy properly." As he spoke, Thomas became aware that Elizabeth was watching him with intense interest. There was something in her expression, recognition, perhaps, or confirmation of suspicions she'd been harboring. You speak about aircraft systems with remarkable authority for someone whose experience comes from books, Elizabeth said quietly, her words carrying just enough challenge to make Thomas look up from the model airplane. The moment stretched between them, loaded with unspoken questions and careful assessments. Danny glanced between his father and Elizabeth, sensing undercurrents he didn't fully understand, but recognizing the importance of whatever was happening. "I've always been interested in how things work," Thomas said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Aviation systems aren't that different from any other mechanical systems." But Elizabeth wasn't satisfied with deflection. "Thomas, I've been a CEO for 8 years. I've learned to recognize competence, especially competence that's being deliberately hidden. What I saw at that crash site wasn't book learning. That was experience." The confrontation Thomas had been avoiding for weeks was finally happening, played out over dinner plates and a child's model airplane. He could feel the walls of his carefully constructed anonymity crumbling under the weight of Elizabeth's determined curiosity. "What do you want me to say?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying a hint of the frustration he'd been suppressing. "That I'm more than I appear to be? That there are things in my past I'd rather not discuss? I want you to tell me why a man with your obvious knowledge and skills is working as a librarian," Elizabeth replied, her voice gentle but implacable. "I want to understand why someone who clearly understands aircraft systems better than most mechanics is shelving books for minimum wage." Emma, oblivious to the tension building between the adults, continued working on her model airplane. But Danny was watching his father with eyes that had seen too much disappointment to believe in easy answers. "Sometimes," Thomas said slowly, choosing his words with the care of someone navigating through dangerous airspace, "people make choices that limit their future options. Sometimes protecting your principles costs more than you expect to pay." Elizabeth leaned forward slightly, her CEO instincts recognizing the shape of a story that might finally explain the puzzle Thomas Wright represented. "What kind of choice? What principles?" Thomas looked at his son, then at Emma innocently building her airplane, then at Elizabeth with her intelligent eyes and persistent questions. The moment of decision had arrived with the inevitability of weather patterns he'd once tracked across radar screens. "I was a commercial airline pilot," Thomas said finally, the words carrying the weight of a decade's worth of careful secrecy. "Captain Thomas Wright, Horizon Airlines. I flew international routes for 12 years before I made the mistake of putting safety ahead of corporate profits." The silence that followed felt like the moment between lightning and thunder. You knew the impact was coming, but not exactly when or how powerful it would be. Elizabeth sat back in her chair, her expression shifting from curiosity to something approaching awe. "You're a pilot," she said quietly, as if testing the words. "A real pilot. That's how you knew what to do at the crash site. That's why you understood exactly what was happening when our aircraft got into trouble." Thomas nodded, feeling strangely relieved to finally have the truth in the open. "I reported safety violations that Horizon was covering up, maintenance issues, cost-cutting measures that put passengers at risk. When I wouldn't back down, they found ways to make me unemployable." Emma looked up from her model airplane, her 8-year-old mind processing this new information with the straightforward logic of childhood. "So, you used to fly the big airplanes, like the ones that go to other countries?" "Yes, sweetheart," Thomas said, his voice gentling as he addressed the child. "I flew all over the world, Europe, Asia, South America. It was the best job I ever had until it became impossible to do it with a clear conscience." Elizabeth was studying Thomas with new eyes, seeing not the quiet librarian she'd met at the crash site, but the experienced pilot who'd sacrificed his career for principles that most people would never have the courage to defend. "The aircraft that crashed with Emma and me," she said slowly. It was connected to the company you reported, wasn't it? Thomas met her gaze directly for the first time since he'd started telling his story. Horizon Charter Services. Same management, same maintenance practices, same willingness to cut corners that endanger lives. When I heard that tail number on the radio, I knew what was going to happen because I'd been trying to prevent it for 10 years. The revelation hung in the air between them like a flight plan that would determine where they went from here. Elizabeth realized she was looking at a man who'd literally saved her daughter from the consequences of a corporate decision he'd tried to prevent a decade earlier. The irony was almost overwhelming, but so was the sense of rightness, as if the universe had arranged for exactly the right person to be in exactly the right place when Emma's life depended on it. "Thomas," Elizabeth said quietly, her voice carrying a respect that hadn't been there before, "I want to offer you a job, not as a consultant, but as Director of Aviation Safety for Stoneworks Technologies. We're developing software for aircraft maintenance systems, and we need someone with real-world experience to ensure we're building something that actually protects lives instead of just generating profits." The offer was everything Thomas had lost when he'd chosen principles over career advancement, authority, respect, the chance to make a real difference in aviation safety. But it was also terrifying, a step back into a world that had once destroyed everything he cared about. "I don't know," Thomas said honestly. "It's been 10 years since I worked in aviation. My certifications have lapsed, my contacts in the industry are gone. I'm not sure I'm the person you think I am anymore." "You're exactly the person I think you are," Elizabeth replied firmly. "You're someone who puts safety ahead of profit, who has the courage to do the right thing even when it costs everything. That's exactly what my company needs." Danny had been listening to this exchange with growing excitement, finally understanding the path that might lead him to the aviation career he'd dreamed about. "Dad, this could be your chance to get back into the field you love. And maybe I could learn from you, the way I should have been learning all along." But Thomas wasn't ready to commit to a future that felt simultaneously promising and dangerous. "I need time to think about it," he said finally. "This isn't just about me anymore. Any decision I make affects Danny's future too." Elizabeth nodded, understanding the weight of the choice she was asking him to make. "Of course. But Thomas, I want you to know that whatever you decide, I'm grateful beyond words for what you did for Emma. You saved my daughter's life, and you did it because of principles that cost you your career. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." The evening ended with promises to stay in touch and careful exchanges of contact information. But as Thomas and Danny walked home through the Seattle streets, both of them knew that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship and their understanding of what the future might hold. 3 weeks later, Thomas Wright stood at the entrance to Stoneworks Technologies, wearing a suit for the first time in a decade and carrying a briefcase filled with aviation safety protocols he'd spent sleepless nights updating. He'd accepted Elizabeth's offer, not because he was ready to trust the aviation industry again, but because he'd realized that hiding from his past wasn't protecting anyone. Not Danny, not himself, and certainly not the passengers whose lives depended on the systems he might help to improve. Elizabeth met him in the lobby, her professional smile warming into something more personal as she saw the man who'd stepped out of the shadows of his quiet life. "Ready for your first day as Director of Aviation Safety?" Thomas adjusted his tie, a small gesture that carried the weight of 10 years' worth of doubt and determination. "I'm ready to try," he said, "but I should warn you, I haven't changed my mind about putting safety ahead of profit margins." "I'd be disappointed if you had," Elizabeth replied, and Thomas heard in her voice the same respect he'd once earned in cockpits around the world. As they walked toward the elevator that would carry him to his new office, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in 10 years, the possibility that redemption might be found not in forgetting the past, but in using it to build a better future. The first project on his desk was a comprehensive review of aircraft maintenance software, designed to prevent exactly the kind of corner cutting that had nearly killed Elizabeth and Emma. As Thomas opened the first file, he realized that his journey from captain to librarian to director of aviation safety had led him to exactly where he was meant to be. 6 months later, on a clear Saturday morning, Thomas Wright stood at the controls of a small Cessna 172, guiding it through the pattern at Boeing Field. Beside him in the co-pilot's seat, Danny Wright worked through his first flight lesson with the focused intensity of someone who'd inherited his father's love of aviation along with his principles. "Remember," Thomas said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd found his way back to where he belonged. "Flying isn't about controlling the aircraft. It's about understanding the forces around you and working with them to achieve your goals." In the passenger seats behind them, Elizabeth and Emma Stone watched father and son share the knowledge that had been hidden for too long. Emma clutched a perfectly folded paper airplane, one of dozens Thomas had taught her to make with professional precision. "Uncle Thomas," Emma called from the back seat, using the name she'd adopted, despite Elizabeth's gentle corrections. "When I grow up, I want to be a pilot just like you." Thomas met Elizabeth's eyes in the reflection of the cockpit window, seeing in them the same respect and affection that had grown between them over months of working together, of building something that might eventually become love. "Then you'll need to remember that being a pilot isn't just about flying airplanes," he told Emma. "It's about making choices that keep people safe, even when those choices are difficult." As the Cessna climbed into the clear Seattle sky, Thomas Wright realized that some secrets, when finally brought into the light, had the power to transform not just individual lives, but entire families. The man who'd once hidden his identity behind library books had found his way back to the sky, carrying with him the hard-won wisdom that true success wasn't measured in altitude or airspeed, but in the courage to do what was right, regardless of the cost. Below them, the city of Seattle spread out like a map of possibilities, and ahead of them stretched the infinite blue sky that had always called to Thomas Wright. First as a young pilot dreaming of adventure, then as a father protecting his son, and now as a man who'd learned that the most important flights were the ones that brought you home to the people who mattered most. The radio crackled with air traffic control instructions, familiar voices guiding aircraft through the complex dance of controlled airspace. Thomas responded with the professional competence that had never really left him, while beside him, Danny learned the basics of aviation communication. In the passenger seats, Elizabeth and Emma shared the quiet contentment of a family that had found its way to wholeness through the most unlikely of circumstances. And somewhere below, in the Seattle Public Library where Thomas had once hidden among the books, other quiet heroes were shelving stories and dreams, perhaps carrying their own secrets, perhaps waiting for their own moments of redemption. The cycle continued, as it always had, as it always would. Ordinary people making extraordinary choices, guided by principles that lifted them higher than they'd ever dared to imagine possible. Thomas Wright had learned to fly again, not just in the cockpit of an aircraft, but in the complex airspace of human relationships and second chances. And as the Cessna turned toward home, carried on wings of reconciliation and hope, he knew that the best flights were always the ones that brought you back to where you belonged, not to a place, but to the people who saw your true value and loved you not despite your choices, but because of them. The story that had begun with a desperate mother's gratitude had become something larger, a testament to the truth that real heroes don't wear uniforms or carry titles, but simply show up when they're needed most, guided by principles that define not what they do, but who they are. And sometimes, if they're very fortunate, they discover that the people they've helped along the way are ready to help them find their way back home.